today. Like John said, we're going to keep it short. We need plenty of time for questions. Please interrupt with questions. That's completely fine. But we're going to give you just a quick little overview of the incident, what happened, how did we communicate that with the community, and how did it affect Lake Gaston. So we're looking at, here we go. So just for folks who aren't maybe in South Hill on a regular basis, it's seeing the little map, it's a little bit to the north of Lake Gaston, and in the downtown area, it's a really interesting mix of types of property, right? So you've got industrial right here in the center of this picture, you've got residential right next to the industrial, and then you've got commercial on the other side. So we're looking at a lot of asphalt, and we're looking at mixed use types that are all in very close proximity. And right here is where the fire took place and the warehouse was located. So on July 6th, we have the vehicle incident that starts the fire. The initial response includes 1 million gallons of firefighting water. There is a half-mile voluntary evacuation. And the warehouse, as you can see, is completely burned. There are a few different factors that influence our response at this point. The first is location. Like I mentioned, we're right next to residential property, and the warehouse location is on 2 watersheds. It's right in the middle, so we have water draining from the property to 2 different watersheds, and both of those go through residential areas. So we've got this big fire, we've got a bunch of chemicals that burned. We're looking initially at over 250 different potential chemicals that could have been involved. And normally when we do a pollution incident, there's maybe 1 or 2 chemicals. So you can test for certain things, you can determine what's happened. It's pretty easy to determine what possible health effects could be. But in this incident, we've got all these different chemicals that we're looking at. And all of that is now in the storm system that's going through these residential areas. So our immediate first concern is, what do we need to do to keep people safe? And so what we do initially is we begin, in addition to the voluntary evacuation, there is flushing that takes place. And so we send water from the fire hydrants through that system because there's a strong odor and it's in this residential area, right? So we send an additional, not we personally, but the response team as a whole sends an additional 1 million gallons of water through the fire hydrant system into these waterways. And that is to get that smell, that odor, that we're not sure what effects may be associated with that odor moving past this residential area. So you've got the location, you've got the runoff. We're looking at millions of gallons of water from the firefighting efforts that the firefighters did a heroic effort. I mean, you can see the properties right next door are still standing, still intact. And that's thanks to their extremely hard work on that. And then, like I said, you've got all these different chemical types that we're looking at and having to consider what are the possible impacts, what are these chemicals' interactions when they get into contact with each other, what happens when they burn up. And so what we do is we start air monitoring first and foremost. Air monitoring starts on July 7th and is continuing. I believe recently it stopped because there's no movement on the pad, but anytime that there is movement of materials on that pad, the air is being monitored to make sure there's nothing potentially detrimental. And then the flushing takes place the 7th through the 9th. And then on the 8th, we begin water monitoring and water sampling to determine what was in that water that just all got flushed down to, preserve public safety. So that's in the immediate term. And then we get into this like, okay, we've stabilized, we think people in their homes are safe. Now we have to look at what literal downstream impacts there are going to be from this. And so that sampling continues through July 24th. And the thing about having all these different chemicals in the water is, like John said earlier, there's no one test that can tell you what's in the water. We ran, I can think of 4 off the top of my head different types of tests, and I believe there were probably more than that to try and determine what of the broad variety of things were in that warehouse are in the water in detrimental quantities. And then, of course, of those 250 compounds that are in the fire, those are made up of multiple chemicals, right? So there's a lot to consider in terms of trying to get these samples back. And so the things that are factors in the response when we get into this midterm stage are, firstly, we have this extremely limited access to these portions of the waterways. We had very few areas where we could access the water on Mountain Creek and Dockery Creek. We had folks one day, it was like 100 degrees out hiking like a mile through the woods trying to get access to this river and get eyes on how far downstream this had gone. And so in the initial interim, like in that initial time period, there's a little bit of uncertainty about exactly where everything is, and we're doing our best to get a handle on it as quickly as we can. But of course, while that's in process, we're being as protective of public health as possible. So, you've got the limited access, and then the whole water column is affected, right? These aren't chemicals that rise to the top, they're not chemicals that sink to the bottom, they are distributed entirely throughout the water column. And what that means for our response on the pollution side is that that limits our tactics that we can use to recover those chemicals out of the water. And so we evaluated a lot of different options, and the conclusion that we came to is there was nothing we could do in this case that wouldn't be more detrimental than letting it continue through the waterway, which is never the conclusion that we want to come to, but in this case, just with the practicalities the way they were, that's the way it worked out. And so you've also got this low flow rate and flow volume, and this is specific to Dockery, which flows into Miles, flows into Lake Gaston. The waterway was fairly stagnant to the point where even after a large rain event, we had very little movement of this product. And that wasn't immediately apparent to us. We weren't sure. It took us a few days because of the limited access to determine how quickly things were moving. But after a few days, we're like, oh my gosh, it's not moving very far, it's not moving very fast, and that has impacts for our advisories. But because of all those factors and because of the testing, the one other factor for consideration here was the samples that we're running. We had trouble getting the data back from those because of all these different chemicals that were in the samples, and one of those is a chemical that bubbles heavily when it's agitated. And so when it goes through the machinery to get the sampling, there were problems with the samples going through the machine, and it took a longer time than normal to get our results back. So all of those are factors in our decision-making process. And as the pollution response agency, we collect all that data and then we pass it over to VDH, and they can make public health decisions based on it. So with that little precursor of what was going on around this like midpoint in the event, I'll invite Wes up to give the VDH story. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just have a quick question. My memory's a little hazy, but in July there wasn't a whole lot of rainfall, right?
Correct. We had two major rain incidents during the first kind of on the ground 3 weeks phase of the incident. There was the Saturday that the fire happened. The following weekend there was a large rainfall anticipated.
Okay.
So we spent a week really gearing up for like how can we keep nothing else from washing off the pad during this rainfall, and we were really hoping that in that rainfall we would see some movement of this product so that it would kind of not settle here like it had done so much damage to these little areas. And then we had one more rain event that was later on, but by that point that was probably I think the week of the 20th that we had the second rain incident. But it was fairly dry during that time period, yes.
Thank you.
Just, I'm curious, when did DEQ realize that Houston we have a problem? You know, there's fires going on. How soon after the fire on July the 6th did you get involved?
Did you want to?
Well, yeah, so I'll help field that question.
Go for it.
That same day, as soon as we knew we had an agricultural chemical warehouse fire that they're applying hundreds of thousands up to 1 million gallons of water, we knew that would be an issue. And so Holly's boss, my former deputy, went to the site that evening. So we were aware, same day. Yes, sir.
So what was the timeline with getting like a barriers around the immediate site to, you know, maybe protect outside environments, waterways, what have you, from spill, from chemical? And the second question is the company responsible to do that? Or do the firefighters or DEQ, or who would do that?
I'm going to answer in a general sense, sort of how emergency response occurs, and then I'm going to turn it over to Holly for specifically what happened at this location. So for any pollution incident, the 99.9% of the time, the first people who arrive to begin to take action are the men and women of the first responders. That's our fire and EMS and could be police force. So that's why we always tell everyone, if you witness any type of pollution incident, even though you may know that the Department of Environmental Quality has a role in that, you need to call 911 because depending on the locale, they have the resources to take some immediate actions, and that's usually how it unfolds. But then after that, specifically, as the response organization comes together, which is the responsible party, it can be the state, it can be federal entities, locality, then they join forces. And within Virginia, we have the Department of Emergency Management, and they maintain a hazardous materials program that has hazardous material officers around the state, as well as hazardous material response teams that they can call upon, that are comprised of actual local resources who receive additional training and materials through funding from the Department of Emergency Management. But usually the first, what will happen is 911 gets called. And if a locality says, hey, this is more than we can handle and we need assistance, they call back to the state, a hazardous material officer comes and becomes engaged, and if he needs additional resources, he reaches back and he can bring a hazmat team. So that's, in a broad sense, that's how pollution incidents unfold. But specifically for South Hill, Holly can explain to you what took place right after.
Thank you.
Right, so initially, the initial actions that were taken, of course, the firefighting is the priority. Life safety, human safety is the priority. So the firefighters are out, they're out putting water on the fire, doing firefighting, keeping those houses protected, which they did an amazing job. I'm really impressed that those were all still standing and relatively intact. Hazmat is on site same day. DEQ is on site same day. But when I showed you the overhead view, you can see just how much asphalt is around there. So the options for containing all that water, when we're talking 2 million, initially 1 million gallons of water, the options are a little bit limited in terms of how to best contain that. So starting, I believe, as soon as the next day, once the actual firefighting had concluded and there's no more water running off the pad from the firefighting operations, the company that was involved began putting their contractors to work building trenches around. And those trenches, the purpose of those was when this rainfall came the following week to contain that water. So just we didn't have a lot of options available while the fire was being worked, but as soon as the fire stopped, that was the first course of action was we need to cover the material on the pad, we need to build trenches around the pad, and then we need to put absorbent in areas where the water won't flow into those trenches so that we can keep anything else from coming off of this pad.
Thank you.
So the other thing that I'll add as we turn it over to Wes, Holly mentioned that it's an agricultural warehouse with 250 plus materials being stored, which is a combination of herbicides, pesticides, nutrients, and surfactants. And the surfactants, does anyone work in the agricultural industry? So the surfactants help when you're applying herbicides and pesticides. So it's part of the formulation when they make spray applications. And we had a prior pollution incident in Roanoke where it was just a release of surfactants, that only. And it had detrimental effects to aquatic life because you put soap into water and fish and the insects, it's no good for them as far as their uptake of oxygen. So the reference to the sampling and that analytical problems was due in some part to the surfactants in the water as they were putting those samples into their instrumentation. And not to get too technical, but they actually pass a carrier gas through the sample. And as they were bubbling that carrier gas through the sample, it just bubbled up. And so it affected their instrumentation. So that was part of the delay. But I will say, as we turn it over to Wes, as we're looking at the water column, or the streams, as we're waiting, and it took a long time for us to get analytical data back, one of the things that DEQ did for this incident, we do it for other incidents as well, is we make visual observations of what's happening in the water. And in this instance, we saw that there were aquatic mortality, so dead fish, dead insects. Additionally, we can use some real-time instrumentation to take some readings of dissolved oxygen, the pH of the water, and the temperature, and then another measurement which is called specific conductivity. And that measurement we can actually see is if you introduce chemicals into a waterway, you can actually see, in many instances, an increase in specific conductivity. And so it was visual observations plus measurements of specific conductivity, which allowed us to say, hey, based on those observations, we know this material is in this stream or waterway down to a certain point. And so for those of you who were looking at our website over time, and we made reference to observed impacts, that's how we measure. So with that, and the fact that we had observed impacts, and we shared that information with our partners at the health department, then they took action. So Wesley, we'll turn it over to you.
The health department's main objective is to look after health and safety of people. When we started hearing that this stuff was in the water, of course our brain goes to, where's the water going? We had it going in two different directions, had it going down the Mayheron, which was ultimately had the potential and did affect the water uptake from some of the water treatment plants downstream. Coming toward Gaston, we had the concern of what was going to happen to the waterways that people live on, play on, eat fish that come out of, and how's it going to affect them. And until we started getting actual lab data back to know exactly what was going on, out of an abundance of caution, we tried to target as many obvious, readily accessible points where people would put in boats, kayaks, swim, camping areas, things of that nature. And we actually put up recreational advisories. And I don't know if any of you guys actually had the opportunity to see them. And we left those in place until we were able to determine through the testing that DEQ and some of the other partners had done, determined that, okay, well, the levels have either not reached the point where they're a problem or a danger, or they have decreased now, so the waters are safe. So that was the biggest portion of the health department's response was the water intake, which comes under ODW, drinking water, and the health department, and that's where we came in. ODW is under the health department, but that's not under our purview in our district. So, but we did look after trying to identify and warn people about safe drinking or safe swimming, taking of fish, even being in the water, whether there's any toxicity going to be associated with that. I did bring some literature. I laid it on the table back there. Most of it's from CDC. There's a pamphlet from says Virginia's natural waters, but you could substitute North Carolina as well. It's best practices. If you're going to be in natural waters, of course, you want to limit any intake. You don't want to drink any more than you have to. Bathe when you get out of it. Be mindful of recent rains that may have washed. It doesn't have to be a warehouse fire. It could be agricultural runoff. It could be just stormwater off of the streets. You want to stay away from places where you've got discharge of stormwater and things of that nature. And just if you please feel free to pick that information up and utilize it, and it will help to keep us safe in case we do decide to go swim in natural waters. I'm a big fan of them. I wake surf, I swim, I play with my grandkids. So the water is great. You just have to try to be mindful of what potentiality may be out there. And once DEQ is able to clear the board, so to speak, we called to pick up the advisors that we had posted, and hopefully there was. I've not heard of any negative impact from it from the Virginia side. I don't imagine we have anything that's happened downstream as well. So, for as bad an incident as it was, I think that there's been a really great outcome. Any questions?
Yeah,
Wait.
Wesley,
Okay.
you talked about the data that you were looking at, determining that there was hazard, those chemicals actually were at a hazardous level. Miles Creek, there's several places you can easily access Miles Creek. I know, Creek. Oh, Dockery, thank you. Dockery's hard to access, but we did some visual observations shortly after the incident occurred. And I know information I've seen in the past miles is very low dissolved oxygen level. I mean, when you look at it compared to the lake, you know, the river upstream, it's just slow moving. There's, you know, you don't see a lot of activity, aquatic or wildlife on it when you're, and I know John's probably kayaked up it several times. But did the data ever indicate to you on that stretch of miles before the water actually made its way into the Roanoke River and Lake Gaston that there were a high level of hazardous chemicals in miles?
Yeah.
I'll let Holly answer that question. She's more attuned to the chemicals that were actually coming through.
Right, so VDH set parameters, screening values for the chemicals in terms of what they consider to be protective of public health. Those are conservative values. They have considerable safety measures built in. So if you exceed the value, it doesn't necessarily mean you've caused a person harm. It just means we need to investigate further. And on miles, I do not recall any hits, I suppose you'd say, above those screening values. There was one chemical in Dockery that exceeded the screening values, but nothing else for the duration of the event exceeded the screening values. The issue we had, of course, was the delay in the data, and so we're finding this data out considerably. I mean, we probably had about a week of delay, so we wouldn't. I wouldn't want to speak for VDH, but we would want to be cautious in the meantime.
Right. The health department, our mantra is, if we're going to make an error, it's going to be on the side of caution. So any values that we need would be extremely conservative. Did that answer your question at all?
I think so, yes.
Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, did you happen to find any canisters or containers of methyl bromide in the warehouse?
There'd be an inventory kept, some other chemicals on site.
Or maybe was it on the list of 250?
Methyl bromide is it's usually put in the soil in a gaseous state.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just curious, I realize that we're not talking about something coming down, but it certainly could be released, and it's, the federal government tries to control the most of any farm chemical.
So I'm glad that you clarified that that is a fumigant that is in gaseous state, because there in the warehouse, there were a number of compressed gas cylinders, many of which failed during the fire, and then a series of which were still intact. And the Nutrient Ag Solutions actually brought a specialty contractor in so that they could manage and dispose of those intact compressed gas cylinders. So it's possible that that compound was present, but I couldn't tell you whether it was or wasn't, or if it was it in one of the cylinders that was compromised during the fire, or one of the cylinders that was handled subsequent to the fire.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Tom, first of all, I think your response was very good communication, was good on the part of all the agencies involved. First, from a response standpoint, how quickly were you made aware of the inventory of the chemicals and products that were in the facility itself after the incident?
Okay. So, in a typical pollution response, when, again, whether it's methyl ethyl terrible or some other compound, one of the first things that the response community does is they request from the responsible party, and they are required by law to have these on site, copies of safety data sheets for the materials. So it was pretty shortly after, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, that we requested, hey, what do you have on site, or what is potentially on site? And they immediately, within, it was on the day after the incident, the personnel who were required, the environmental health and safety personnel required to maintain that information, began to compile that list and begin to turn it over to us. And I think by the second day, they had turned over, and there were so many, they actually had to give it to us on a thumb drive.
So the company was compliant, they had the information?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Second question was, you talked about some of the chemicals being released, some of them will volatilize, some of them will degrade quickly. I'm curious, do you have any concerns about the persistency of any of these chemicals that have been released that might persist in the environment a little bit longer?
That question came up. I'm going to have to defer to Holly to where that landed. I know that the examination of whether or not there were aquatic mortalities, they did see, and Holly, correct me if I'm wrong, they did see aquatic life return to the headwaters of Dockery and Mountain Creek, which, from an environmental practitioner's perspective, that indicates that there's not a lingering impact. I mean, if DEQ, and I don't know where we landed on this, whether or not there'll be a need to go back and look at and do a benthic survey, and that's a reference. Benthic survey is where we actually go and look at, I guess you call it the lowest end of the life cycle. You're looking at the bugs and whatnot that live on the bottom of the streams, and if they're present, then you have, and depending on what's present, you can tell the health of the stream.
So none of the items that were in the inventory would give you concern, at least initially. So it's a question of continuing to monitor and possibly go back if necessary. So the question, I guess, was, is there any chemicals that were on the list that were released that would give you an indication that, hey, these are potentially going to persist in the environment longer, so we have to continue a longer term evaluation?
I mean, I can't give a firm yes or no on that. The way we normally process these, we have an initial emergency response, incident response phase, and then we turn over to our long-term remediation programs. And so some of those programs still have this information and are still evaluating those kinds of concerns. What I can say is that the majority of the chemicals that we looked at had pretty short kind of degradation timeframes. But I'm not fully aware, like John said, there's an option for potential further assessment, and I don't have all of the details on where we landed on that.
Okay, thank you.
So what's the extent of continuing the water monitoring, quality monitoring?
We're gonna get to that. Wes, did you have any more?
I don't have anything more to add. If anyone has a question for the health department in particular, I'll be glad to address them at any point, but I'm gonna turn it back over to Holly. It looks like most of the questions are chemical oriented. It's not my wheelhouse. We'll give it back to her.
I just have one quick question.
Yes.
For you, maybe. So have you been continuing, has the department been continuing to do water samples? I don't know how far downstream or even into the lake or other places to monitor that quality of water, looking for chemicals or parts per million or what have you?
I can give you an answer. They may be able to clarify. But once the chemical levels had peaked, so to speak, and had come back down below concerning levels, we didn't feel a need. The health department, now DEQ may have a bigger plan, she referred to, but the health department, once those levels dropped below the concerned areas, we've not pursued it.
Do you have a rough date or timeline when those levels came back to normal or below normal? Like so many days afterwards or what have you?
It varied from one stream or one
Sure.
creek to the next, actually, because of how fast the stream was actually moving.
Right.
I have a question concerning the relationship between Virginia and North Carolina, because this lake pretty much divides the two states. Did North Carolina Department of Health ever get involved in any of this? Or were there active lines of communication? Because we didn't hear anything as far as I know from the North Carolina side.
We as an agency communicated with North Carolina, I think their environmental quality, as well as their health department. I was not involved in that communication. I do not know what the extent of that may have been. But yes, they were aware. And I'm not aware of any excessively high readings down into the body of Gaston. But I'm gonna turn it back over to Holly and willing to answer any health department questions that we may have.
Yeah, so what I can tell you about the initial kind of communication with North Carolina, the Department of Health, as soon as they issued that first recreational advisory that was just for Dockery and Mountain Creek, that notification went to North Carolina. And then when they expanded it to go all the way to the state line, North Carolina was again notified from our health department to their health department. And North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality was involved. They took samples on the North Carolina side. They were involved in our planning calls. I can't recall exactly when they got involved, because it definitely was a little bit later since they're further downstream. But they were made aware, and they were involved in the response. So they weren't necessarily sitting this one out.
And this isn't really a question, it's more of a comment, but when the advisories were listed to the state line, as an uninformed reader, it was hard to know whether that meant Pea Hill Creek or not. Because I don't know if that means all of Lake Gaston north of the state line, or whether that means Lake Gaston as far east as the state line the first time the lake crosses the state line, but not farther. You know,
So, I'll speak to that, Holly. And I happen to know the answer to this because I reached out to our Department of Health and said, hey, if you read the advisory the way it's listed, they didn't specifically list Miles Creek. They said Dockery to Lake Gaston, and I said, hey, wait a second, it goes Dockery Miles to Lake Gaston. But if you read the advisory, it was listed as Dockery to Lake Gaston / the Roanoke River, and from there down to the state line. So that would have excluded Pea Hill Creek. Though there were naturally questions from residents all along Lake Gaston, and I specifically recall getting a question from one or two residents of Pea Hill Creek asking, is there a concern here? And even took a call from the emergency manager from Virginia Beach, and had folks from Virginia Beach Public Water Supply or the Service Authority contacting us about the likelihood of a threat to their intake. So, yep. There are questions? Okay.
And one thing I'll say that's great feedback, thank you for that, is that after any event like this happens, we do a thorough after-action process that involves all of the agencies who responded, and we take the types of questions we received that had to do with issues like that, and all of the other factors, and we learn from this. We make sure to improve our operations, so we do appreciate feedback and what went well and what we could maybe work on. It is helpful and it is taken into consideration. Okay, so real quick, just what we're doing now, what's ongoing operations right now, and then we'll get into the communication piece a little bit more in depth. In terms of the long-term response, what we're doing right now, like I mentioned before, we have long-term programs that deal with remediation and long-term water impacts and stuff like that, and those folks are heavily involved right now in the ongoing operations. We've got three kind of main things that we are working on. First is site containment. That's done. Site containment is done. The site is contained. It looks like it does in this picture over here, where there's the hay bales, there's plastic tarps, there's absorbent placed, there's trenches placed, and that keeps anything new from running off the pad and creating an additional concern. We're trying to move from there into site cleanup and getting materials off the pad, getting the pad washed down, getting things returned to kind of a normal state. That can be a lengthy and complicated process just because removal of hazardous waste has a lot of different kind of contingencies that can make that take a little bit longer. But that's something that we are actively working. There's a meeting going on right now about it while we're talking here. And then the other thing is the water monitoring. And water monitoring is ongoing for Lake Gaston annually. And so a lot of what we're doing falls back into that. By the time we stopped sampling on the 24th of July because all of the sample results were below screening values. Like John mentioned, we were starting to see fish and other, wildlife returning to the impacted areas. So samples were below the screening values by the time we stopped sampling. And we've moved into kind of the long-term phase of the operations. So we have a little more information that we can talk about the ongoing monitoring, what that looks like, but I wanted to turn it over to John first and talk a little bit about the communications while we're kind of looking backwards at what happened and how it happened, and then we can look forward to what's going on now and what'll go on in the future. So if that's all right with everybody, we'll go ahead and turn over to John.
Okay. So communication efforts. In the continuum of all the pollution incidents that, at least in my time with DEQ, where I've been involved, this one involved the greatest communication effort. Understandably, there was a great need for information to be shared out with the community, so we had established by the Wednesday after the incident, we brought together the public information officers from these agencies listed here. So DEQ, and we did take the lead role for joint information. And a joint information team is a term of art when it comes to pollution response. Is there anyone who's involved and ever been involved with, I guess, incident management and incident? Okay, so there's a construct called the incident command structure. And part of that is the formation of a joint information team, or they can also be, it could be referred to as a joint information center. And the importance of coming together in that manner with these public information officers is we need to aggregate information, and we need to harmonize that information, and we need to share it out with one voice. Otherwise, we run the risk of sending out conflicting information, and as soon as you, the public, receive conflicting information, well, EPA said this, DEQ said that, then immediately calls into question, do we really know what we're talking about? But that does take time. So this group was brought together on the Wednesday after the incident occurred, and some of you may think, well, it seems a little slow. I mean, the communications began between joint information, public information officers of the listed entities here, and then we formally met on that Wednesday. Within the pollution response or emergency management realm, we often look at the first few days after an incident as we have to use the term organized chaos, because you're busy bringing the right entities in and creating the incident management team that needs to go on and manage the incident. So the communication efforts, the greatest that I think we have done to date, and we're, as Holly said, we look at these and we're still learning from the incident itself, and we do that both on the incident management, but also separately on the information management side. So we pretty quickly put up a web page, and then that was followed by a call center, which is a Department of Health central office call center. The bulletins, we added this functionality as time went on. I don't know if anybody availed themselves of the web page. There was a widget at the bottom of the web page that allowed you to submit questions, and we got quite a few through that medium. There were news releases. Those typically took the form, though, of the public health advisories, and then inquiries from the residents, whether it was direct phone calls received to our agency or one of our partner agencies. Also the questions received through the web page, and as Holly mentioned, we're documenting those efforts and what went well and what didn't, because we always want to learn from incidents that have occurred. Just some metrics. The web page in the first 2 weeks had 22,000 visitors. That's as many as our DEQ homepage gets in 6 weeks. And there were up to, at one point, 3,000 visits on that web page per day. We received 50 emails through that web page widget that I mentioned, and for this bulletin, which is, we did that as a proactive push as opposed to pull. So the pull means you have to go to the website and see information and get it yourself, versus push, if you signed up for the bulletin, then as we issued them, and we didn't issue many, we wanted to time them with when we had significant updates to information on the webpage, then that was a push, and would land in your inbox, and you would know that there was additional information. And we had 350 people subscribe to that. Both the web pages the web page is still up, and the bulletin is still a thing. It's been rather quiet because things are progressing slowly, as Holly just mentioned on the prior slide. Challenges to communications. So, expectations of the public. Raise your hand if you do not own a cell phone. Okay. So, what we consider in the communication world is because these are ubiquitous. You think about it. If you want to know who's the actor in that movie, it's right here. The answer's here. You can get it. If you want to look up the temperature, what's the forecast? It's right here. And if you want to tell your significant other you pick up eggs on the way home, you can do it instantaneously. So there's a certain expectation among the public that, hey, that information should be available right now. But that is not the reality when it comes to a pollution incident that's unfolding. Our reality is that it takes time to gain situational awareness. So we knew it was a warehouse fire. Again, Holly's boss, my direct report, responded immediately, responded that day. But now she has to be there, and she is trying to understand what is going on here, what are we dealing with? And we painted a picture like, well, now we know where water went, but they didn't know immediately. So they're on site, and they're bringing in the town of South Hill Public Works. What can you tell us? Where does this go? Where does that go? And they're scrambling the information. So it takes time to generate situational awareness. And then, as we already spoke, data acquisition takes time. And even after data comes back, there has to be a validation or a vetting of information or data quality determination. And I do recall this vividly during the Duke coal ash spill, that, and I'm not picking on North Carolina, but there was some data that was released before it was properly QA/QC'd, and the number changed. And that's a big no-no in the pollution response movement. If you release a number, that number better be correct. And especially as the trusted entities, we have to be correct from the beginning. This is the bane of our existence, but anybody who sees a pollution incident and has a phone who can begin to become a social reporter and take images and post that information, well, they don't have to be correct. They can say anything they want. But we have to be correct. But that takes time. And we have to be right the first time, because we can't go and change our story. Once we change our story, our credibility is out the window. So that's the reality of emergency response. Part of that is misinformation. And misinformation is not, I'm going to use that term not as intentional misinformation, but misinformation. Who's ever played the game of telegraph or telephone, where I'm going to tell you something, you're going to tell them to them. By the time you do that, it's invariably you introduce some misinformation. And it was not with ill intent, it just is part of human nature. And we also are dealing with multiple lines of communication, because some people want to tell their friends. Lake Gaston Association wants to tell their membership, hey, here's what's going on, here's what we can share. And it can be problematic when we've got multiple lines of communication, and some people have some of the information, some people have some information, it might be misinformation, they're sharing that. So we are dealing with that reality as another challenge. And then when you get that information, now it's conflicting. Well, I heard this, and someone else heard that. And then we deal with we, the communication side, deal with multiple communications channels, which again are these channels. And we have to tailor content, in some instances we have to tailor content to different communication channels. But most importantly, and I've already mentioned this, is unity of message. The response community and that team that comes together has to speak with one voice, and if we don't, we lose credibility, because I heard this from the health department, I heard this from DEQ, I heard this from someone else. So these are our challenges, and they're known challenges, but they take time. What you should know, and there's a couple of things, and not all of them are up here in the slide. We do have, our pollution response program maintains contacts for neighboring states, because we have a lot of water bodies in Virginia that flow either into to our neighboring states to the west, that can flow into, as we know for this incident, can flow into North Carolina, or into Maryland. And so we do have those contacts, and we do reach across on a regular basis, and they reach across to us. But really the big thing that I would say is you want to rely on official sources of information. And I know that it almost sounds trite when we say, trust us, we're the government, and people chuckle. But we really do want to put information out there for folks, and we want to work quickly, but we cannot work as quickly as the citizen reporter or the media, because the media, while they have the professional standard is that they want to be correct. They want to get a story out there. And so, and I have seen this, I saw this on the Duke Coal Ash, I keep coming back to the Duke Coal Ash energy spill, coal ash spill. I remember driving to the site one morning, listening to the radio, and hearing a piece of information that I knew was explicitly incorrect. And I thought, come on, media, don't do that. But it happens. So, I would just encourage you to go here. And for this incident, for you, Jeff, you reached out early and said, hey, would you guys come talk to us here today, this time? Conceivably, you could have asked us to come out earlier and have an ad hoc meeting. We would have entertained that. So, but again, we want to put information into your hands. The most important, we can't speculate. We get a lot of questions from people. And I'll give you an example of some that we got from residents who live along the lake. They wanted to know, they'll ask with this question, is it safe to swim after this incident? And we don't want to offer speculation, but we do want to offer information. So what, in some instances, what I was able to share back with those residents, and did anyone here reach out to DEQ? I'm looking at all these people, and I was wondering whether any of those emails came in. Was from anyone here?
I just looked at the websites.
Say again?
I just looked at the websites and
Okay.
Yeah. Tammy, our executive director, she was daily, multiple times daily, monitoring.
Okay.
I was probably like 100 hits a day.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll be interested in your feedback then. So, for instance, people would say, "Hey, I didn't know about the advisory, but I went swimming in Lake Gaston, or I did, and my children, and I felt for these people, and I told Jeff this. I was a Lake Gaston resident for many years. We had a place off of Hubport. So I knew the importance of those questions as someone who fished and recreated on this lake. And I could offer up information such as, hey, we're monitoring this incident, and we have not observed, and I know that people got frustrated by this because it never changed, we have not observed impacts below the confluence of Miles Creek and Dockery Creek. I'll go back to this image. So this is Dockery coming out from South Hill. And Holly, I take it that this star represents where this image is?
Yes.
Okay. So that's probably where one of the roads crosses. And right about here is where Dockery comes together with Miles before it goes down to the Roanoke River / Lake Gaston. And we didn't see any aquatic impacts, and that signifies here, beyond here. And we did get questions. Well, you've been saying for now weeks or days that became weeks that there are no impacts. How is that possible? Well, we have, I've actually collected this information before this meeting. The drainage area for Dockery Creek is 11 square miles. For Miles Creek, it's 33 square miles. Okay? So you have quite an impact for what's coming in from Dockery Creek. Anyone want to take a guess at what the drainage area is when both of those, when Miles Creek gets to the Roanoke River Lake Gaston? What's the drainage area above that point?
Oh, yeah, if you consider Carn all the way up
Yeah.
to the Blue Ridge, it's hundreds of
It's
thousands.
7,866 square miles. And that told me, again, I'm a Hokie, civil engineer, that by the time anything got that far, it'd be lost. So it was information like that that I could share with people saying, hey, well, we don't observe any impacts beyond here, and we have such a volume of water coming down from the Roanoke River. That, you know, that they needed to consider that, you know, even if as we would wait for analytical results to come back, and the analytical results did demonstrate there was nothing to see. I think they had one hit for one compound, right at the level of detection. That's the lowest level that the instrument can even provide an actual number.
So we don't like to say, but sometimes dilution is the solution.
Yeah, we don't like to say that.
John does though, it's
True.
Yeah, it's so then, as Holly said earlier in her presentation, with and this is typical with chemicals that mix or a pollutant that mixes throughout the water column. So the water column is basically it's full depth. That we couldn't pull all the water out of that creek because of the impacts it would have downstream creek. Lots of things that rely on that, and there within the site for where they were setting up and designing for the capture of any rainfall that would hit that site, so they would eliminate future impacts. That was an extreme effort. They did it. So, yeah. Other questions?
Another comment, while you guys are trying to deal with the potential consequences of the spill and release, there's other natural things going on, especially in the summertime with reduced dissolved oxygen in the lake. And so Jeff and I and some of the other folks at the LGA would get questions or comments. I saw some fish belly up, here or there, and that's not necessarily a direct consequence of this. It's part of the natural environment and the ecosystem that occurs as dissolved oxygen is reduced in the lake.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there were residents, for not down as far as the North Carolina line, that were reporting fish mortalities or deaths, lots of fish, up in a cove. And that is a routine report that the Department of Environmental Quality receives every year, and for different reasons, but typically it's dissolved oxygen. It can be related to increased water temperatures and lack of rainfall, and it can also be from certain species of fish. When they're spawning, they move way up into the shallowest parts of the water body, and it's the density of fish. They just deplete the oxygen up in those headwaters, and then they perish. So, good observation, or comment rather. Other questions on the information management communications side? Go ahead, Jeff.
This is an observation, and North Carolina folks aren't here, so I know they can't speak to it. The advisory came out, you talked about, initially it was on Dockery, Miles, and then shortly thereafter, I think it was to the Virginia state line. There wasn't a map initially that came out, so there was some confusion around that. And then shortly thereafter, I believe a map came up on the website. And it showed the advisory and the state line. So the advisory the Virginia DEQ issued was to the state line.
Advisory that the health department issued.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That was a variation of advisory.
Yeah, yes. So, of course, that's when a lot of questions started happening. Well, does this impact North Carolina? We had a lot of that. And initially, there was not very little coming out of North Carolina. And then I can't, maybe Tammy, you can speak to the time frame here, but then shortly thereafter, North Carolina, I say shortly, it could have been a day, I don't know. They mimicked the advisory that Virginia put out Department of Health. And then, some of the North Carolina County Department of Health went out and posted on access points, boat ramps, a caution. And it didn't use the word recreational advisory.
And that was North Carolina?
No, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, it basically said, don't go in the water. If you go in your boat and you take it out, you need to wash your boat out. I mean, is that sort of, I wish I had a copy of it. And I came to my attention, oh yeah, they've gone around, some of these in subdivisions, that they weren't even public ramps, boat ramps. They were putting up these flyers, posting them, and that, here we're monitoring y'all's website. That's, you were the go-to folks for information. The incident was in Virginia, you guys were on top of it, and we started getting this conflicting information. And then, when you lifted the advisory, I don't know if that's the right word, canceled, whatever, it's still showing up in North Carolina.
Brunswick County, yeah, their website for weeks afterwards still said
Yeah,
advisory.
well, Brunswick County's website still isn't up to date, but
Yeah, that's, so again, you're touching on a communication challenge, but you're also touching on a challenge that is, there are interstate challenges. Okay, so we may have similar approaches, but not exactly the same. So for a lake like this, where you might recreate or live in one portion, you travel, across the line into North Carolina, and you see what you see. That's not a unity of message, and now you're confused, and understandably so. But that's sort of built into the fabric of those state, entities, and then even at the local entities. And I don't want to steal thunder from Wesley, but I know even within Virginia, the advisories are issued at the local health district level. They make those decisions, and so depending on how much you travel through the state of Virginia, you might see one action taken in one part of the state, a more conservative action, and a less conservative approach on issuing advisory in another part of the state, because the health districts operate semi-autonomously. Is that a fair statement?
That is fair.
Yeah. They do get support from the Virginia Department of Health Central Office in the way of technical support and recommendations, but ultimately the local health districts issue the advisories.
okay, so in Virginia you have health districts, and in North Carolina, the counties have a county health department.
Well,
So,
it gets, it's a little more complicated. We have local health departments. The city of Danville has a health department. Pennsylvania County has a health department. Halifax has a health department.
does Brunswick County have?
Brunswick County has a health department. And then the districts will encompass a number of the departments. Pennsylvania Danville is Pennsylvania County, which Pennsylvania County is the largest county in the state, so it's kind of manageable that way. But we also, the leadership for that Pennsylvania Danville is also the Southside Health District, which is Halifax, Mecklenburg, Brunswick. Beyond that, then you've got regions that we work within. And some of our resources, like our public information officer, that we utilize during this time, Rookie.
Rookie?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember her last name.
Oh, Rookie Crawford.
Yeah, Brooke Crawford. She is very assistive, and she'll work with an entire region, or maybe a couple of regions. There's 2 or 3 public information officers in the state, so they've got a bigger grasp, and we work with them. And then of course the local health director of that district signs off on what the advisory is. So as he said, yes, you can have different approaches taken, but you're going to find most of the time the health department is going to err, again, as I said, on the side of caution, just to be sure that we don't take a chance on causing anybody to being any harm.
Well, speaking of that, I know Emporia is don't drink the water for a while, and you have a Creative Health District there.
There's,
So how does that work?
well, you can have a don't drink the water or boil water notice for different reasons. You can have a break in the water main, and again, to err on the side of caution, because that water system may not have been pressurized, it could have allowed some contaminants in. So then the local waterworks will go through a process of sanitizing and treating the lines, and then they will do a flush. But until they get that flush completed, if you draw water out of the main or out, the municipal system, then they urge you to boil the water before you drink it.
But
Just, that's for safety.
But for point of clarification, that function, when it comes to regulated water supplies, that falls under the jurisdiction of Virginia Department of Health's Office of Drinking Water,
Yes.
which is not
Yes, that is not
Board of
ours.
Health Districts.
No, that's not ours. That's just some of the reasons that those will be issued.
Looking forward, how's the cleanup going up in South Hill? We were going into hurricane season, with a possibility of 6 to 10 inches or so of rain.
It's a great question. We turn it back over to Holly.
You guys are quite a tag team operation.
None of us have all the answers.
Good team effort.
Yeah, the name of our game when we do an emergency response is coordination, so we're used to tagging in and working together. So in terms, let's go back here for a second and just look at site cleanup for a second. So we're in the middle of hurricane season. That's always in the back of our minds right now. We're trying to get this taken care of. I think it's safe to say that everyone involved in this would like this cleaned and fully away from here as quickly as possible. And like I said, we work on that every single day. It's going to take a little more time. There's a process by which the materials that are on site have to be categorized, they have to be sampled, they have to be tested, they have to see exactly what's in each of these debris piles that are over here on the site. And then a transporter and a disposal operation will consider whether they would like to take that material or not. And that can be a lengthy negotiation, and there are other regulatory things that feed into a longer conversation about that. In the meantime, containment is like the highest priority, and before the, what was the hurricane, Debbie, excuse me. Before Debbie came through, we've got the trenches on site, we've got everything covered and tarped, we've got dams created so that runoff that has not touched the site is diverted away from the site. And all of that kind of limits the runoff that's coming with these heavy rainfalls and storm events. And so in those trenches, that water accumulates, and then they take a vacuum truck and vacuum it out and put it in these blue tanks over here in this satellite picture. And before the tropical storm remnants came through, that operation was beefed up. They brought in another vacuum truck. They're being very, very diligent about making sure that water does not come off of this site in the meantime. So it is a longer process. We are in the middle of that process right now, and it will take a little longer still to be able to get all of this off site. But in the meantime, there's a lot of care being taken to making sure that nothing additional runs off.
What's the general impact just in the city itself, city of South Hill, like to date? I mean, are there big effects?
What kind of impacts?
Economically, environmentally, residents?
Yeah, I'd have to defer to the city in terms of economic impacts, residential impacts. In terms of the environmental impacts, we've been doing the air monitoring, doing the water monitoring, doing the testing on site, and there are houses residences that border the site that you can see damage to the facades of those buildings. So that's an ongoing conversation also. But I'm sorry, I can't speak to any financial impacts. I know this was a big employer in town, so I think it's a real shame in terms of people's livelihood when this fire came through. But I don't know the statistics. Go ahead.
So, bottom line is, who's paying for all this? as far as cleanup, containment, ongoing down the road, the federal government getting involved in this, is state handling it, insurance companies, you know?
So.
I wanna make sure the public doesn't get stuck ahead.
Right. I'm gonna let John speak to it because he knows all the details. The short answer is, the company involved generally covers the costs on these things, but I don't wanna give any misinformation, so I'm gonna defer to John.
So, this is an interesting situation because in general, so we'll go back to just a general pollution incident. If XYZ tanker company has a gasoline tanker that overturns and spills and there's an environmental impact, there's a cleanup that needs to occur, they're liable for all of that, for all those costs. In this instance, Nutrient Ag Solutions, the resulting fire was caused by that car accident. It wasn't faulty electrical work inside the warehouse. They have been and continue to be extremely cooperative from day one. And so all of this work that's occurring here, this cleanup work, all of that, storing the contaminated water, including hiring contractors that came out to do environmental work, they've paid for all of that. There are costs that we, the state, have incurred, and EPA was involved in this incident. And tangentially on these questions, I mean, different departments within EPA are involved on these questions about the management of hazardous waste, but that just means that they have costs that they incur as well. The question, and this has not been decided, is whether or not we, as the Department of Environmental Quality, go back to Nutrient Ag Solutions and say, hey, these were our costs, reimburse us. But in general, it is, it's whoever's, I use the term yuck, it's whoever's yuck got out in the environment is responsible. That answer your question?
Yeah, it sounds like the insurance company's on the hook for the car accident that caused all of it.
Could be, but I bet you their limits of coverage were exceeded on day one, in the first hour.
Right, yeah.
Is it safe to say there's no more propane tanks on curbside like Southville?
Interestingly, and it's not, so go back to this image, the map. So the propane tanks that were struck were roughly right here. And the car that struck them was traveling off of this street and traveled in this direction, struck those. If you were to look right here, in this building, there are 2 propane tanks that sit outside of that building. So I know for a fact that right now there are propane tanks outside of the building, street side.
So who would get involved in coming up with regulation so this doesn't happen again?
Well, with respect, so I do know that on the second day, and it's either the Sunday or Monday, that the state fire marshal's office was on site to look at this. So there's possible jurisdiction there. I will say that for as difficult as this entire response has been, there are many of us who just thought, if only those propane tanks had rolled maybe just a few more feet down the road, or maybe spun 180 degrees or more, because there was a video, and I wish we had it, that showed the propane tank with the propane on fire and shooting out a jet of propane, and it was perfectly right at the window of the warehouse. Wow. And we thought, oh, if it could have been a few more feet down where it was just a cinder block wall or shooting out into the road, but there's a lot of wishful thinking. So that's a great question. I think it was a very odd set of circumstances that led to this. So go back to Holly's slide where we left off. No?
That's not it.
Do
Okay.
we have more questions before we talk about kind of routine monitoring and ongoing? Go ahead.
It's probably less simple than you think, this question, but you mentioned the cleanup and getting rid of all those materials. Where do they go and how do they impact them?
Yeah, well, there are specific disposal facilities that accept hazardous waste. They're all over the country. They're strictly regulated And so anything that's deemed hazardous would go to those facilities. Go ahead, John, it sounds like you've got that.
But there are 0 in Virginia.
Yeah.
So it's all going out of state when it goes.
Just don't bring it to North Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the same types of facilities that, you know, in an industrial plant, they might generate hazardous waste during a production process, and they have to go through this process of like, okay, what's in it, where can we send it, where is safe, where can contain it correctly, and so all of that applies here. Okay. Anything else? Okay, so in terms of future monitoring, so we talked about how we discontinued sampling, and that's because we had a sense of what was in the various water bodies. We saw the concentrations peak. We saw them taper off. We were comfortable that there would no longer be health impacts, and we'd already seen the environmental impacts, right? So continuing this like daily, weekly sampling process is not really giving us a lot of new information. What we don't know yet is in terms of long-term impacts. We could see that some wildlife, like fish, aquatic life, was starting to return to certain areas, but it can take a while to determine exactly like what the full impact is going to be. And so, starting from Lake Gaston, just because, you know, Lake Gaston Association, there is already every year there is routine monitoring that takes place on the lake, April through October, every single year. There are 3 stations on the Virginia side of the lake, and they're at these little yellowy orange dots. And this arrow here is just where Miles comes in. And so those points are monitored every single month, April through October, every year. They are monitored for these characteristics. So we have dissolved oxygen, pH, specific conductance, which John was talking about earlier. Sometimes they'll peak when there's a contaminant like this involved. Temperature, nitrogen, which includes ammonia, which is important because we did see higher levels of ammonia in some of the sample locations. Phosphorus, bacteria, not super relevant to this, and chlorophyll A. Those are all routinely monitored, and the nitrogen and phosphorus can potentially be of interest in this. We also were seeing when we did our testing in the smaller water bodies effects to those 3 of the 4 in the top row. So those parameters have been collected since the 1990s. There have been 2 collections since this incident took place, and everything is in normal ranges. So we have not seen any impacts. And so that will continue. That will continue. And if we ever were to see fluctuations in these characteristics, we could potentially look at what might have been the cause of that. But that's really the process for Lake Gaston, and because of what's already involved in here, we don't anticipate needing additional sampling just based on what we've already done. So that'll continue, and then we can use that information to make any assessments about if there are any changes to the lake quality based on this. Thoughts about that? Questions? I see thinking faces.
Is that data in the location of those sites that are online?
Okay, yeah.
Great.
And John, do you know, are people able to see the readings online, or is that something that we'd have to? I don't know if we publish those.
Are you referring to dissolved oxygen pH? Those?
Yeah, well, just anything that, these routine monitoring, are the results of the routine monitoring posted for people to see?
I mean, E. coli, we do E. coli sampling.
Yes, they are. It's a little Gordian when you get there, but they are available.
Go ahead.
So, do you, with your pros and cons of things that you've learned, and your well-oiled machine of communication, do you then send that to North Carolina, or do you wait like a good neighbor to see if they request that information? And if they do, then you'll share that information with them? Or do you just, this is what we found, and this is what you need to know to keep you updated?
Do you mean in terms of like these specifically,
Like the
or
whole
just in general?
Yeah, the whole thing. Are you, as a volunteer firefighter, when Virginia, just recently, when Virginia lost somebody in the Roanoke, they had used their monitor to recover a body. Because we work with Virginia, they were working, and they were trying to bring everybody up to speed because they had just had that experience. They allowed us to come alongside Well, we asked, and we came alongside them with our monitor and to compare notes and work with them, because they had just experienced it. They could speak to what we hadn't experienced, didn't know the questions to ask, because we haven't yet experienced it. But through their experience, we all became smarter and knew how to anticipate. Similarly, do you share that with North Carolina, or are you waiting on them to ask that question because you don't want to step on their toes or assume they don't, they'll ask if they want to know? Or do you just, here's what we're doing as we continue our education?
Okay, so you're speaking specifically to the education and improvement and that kind of thing. So we have invited North Carolina to join us in that process.
And?
I can't tell you. I'm so sorry. I didn't think to gather that info. We've got an answer. I just don't know what it is.
Is the large after action?
No, that hasn't taken place yet. We're still determining dates, and that's when, if North Carolina decides to join us, that's probably when they would join us, is when we do a big after action that's for the whole state, and for EPA could potentially come, North Carolina could potentially come, but that's still.
But it's still potential.
Process. It's still potential.
But the invitation is there.
You know what? I don't want to say for sure that it is. Our intention is to invite everyone who was involved with the response, which includes North Carolina, but we're just not there yet, timing wise.
So to answer your question, that is a thing that will happen, absolutely. The after action review, which is sort of what you're referring to, which is hey, here's everything we learned. But it's also a moment, it's actually, that process is to, everybody comes together and shares what they believe to be things that were successful and not successful, opportunities for improvement. And from that is generated a report, which is the after action report that contains, and usually in the very back, an improvement matrix for these things need to be improved upon, and here's the owner who needs to work on the improvement of that thing. And that is to occur.
And so, as a citizen of North Carolina, it would behoove me to ask my representative and ask my environmental, are you ready? Are you involved? Are you engaged? Are you paying attention to the after action that happened in Virginia? Correct? Because they work. I mean, I want to trust you, but the government works for me. That's how I hold them accountable, to make sure that the after action is, we're proactive.
Yeah. So we'll check on the invitation list, but what Holly stated is correct, that anybody who was, as far as entities that were involved in this response, from the local level up through state and federal, typically are all invited to participate in the process.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't tell you for sure that invite has gone out, so I don't know if it's sitting there yet or not. It's coming. Yeah.
And our sister agency, the Department of Emergency Management, is the one that is going to manage that process. They said they will offer that up for you guys to manage the whole after action review process.
Well, I appreciate that you can say that you don't know, but you know what? It's also that when you're exposed and there's things you could have, should have done differently, that is an exposure. And I can appreciate that Virginia, instead of being guarded, that you want to invite other people, because overall we affect one another and we really need to work together. And I appreciate that you're willing to share the wins and the losses. Yeah.
And there are, one last thing I'll add to this, and there are other avenues for that information exchange, and it comes up in September, but Virginia hosts an annual, the Virginia Hazardous Materials Virginia Hazardous Materials
Conference.
Yeah, it's what I call the Hazmat Conference. It's a Hazmat Conference that happens in Tidewater every September, and that is a fantastic avenue where the first responders, and I'm actually true first responders, come together to exchange information, just as I'm sure what you're describing about the loss of a firefighter for some technical, physical reason, that information typically gets shared in basically a presentation. And this is another example of something that could be shared. Hey, these were lessons learned from this incident. They get shared out in the presentation at that time. And then we also, it was my second to last thing. We do exercise within Virginia, and we also exercise across the border. So we've held exercises, joint exercises of different scenarios with Maryland, DC, on a big water contamination one just recently, and then with the U.S. Coast Guard, 2 different Coast Guard sectors, so North Carolina and Virginia, and for a big offshore pollution incident that impacted the Outer Banks. So there are other avenues where when we don't have an incident from which we can learn, we do exercise and see what we can learn from those.
I think that's about all we have in terms of slides and presentation. So what else do we want to talk about? Other questions?
You guys asked a lot of good questions, so
Yeah.
keep them coming.
Keep your mind-
All right.